Today, I'd like to share a little bit about the inner critic and go into the impact and how it affects us, and then also a little bit about what we can do about it. But the main thing I wanted to do today was to give you few of these what are known as cognitive distortions. And these are a very good proxy for knowing when this inner critic is active, because that's obviously the way that we can most easily start to take action and actually minimize its effects. So the impact of this negative inner voice, at a very basic level, it gets in the way of us being productive. It stops us from being productive because energy is going to that voice and to managing that voice. It's taking up space in our mental real estate. It's creating feelings that are sort of not so useful for us in whatever it is we're trying to do. And this is going to be true at work. It's going to be true at in any social situation, pleasure as well. It also impacts our relationships because when we're active, when the inner critic is active, when our inner judge is active, we tend to be in lower self-esteem states. We feel worse about ourselves, and that changes our thinking and our behavior. But it also tends to make us more judgmental of others and circumstances. So it has a very, very big impact. That's just, two areas, productivity and relationships, but it goes through our whole lives. So if we can find ways to manage it, it can really have a big impact. And that's where these cognitive distortions come in. Now, there's one thing I want to say before that, which is that something that can be useful is to recognize that the inner critic is actually a defensive mechanism. It's always, even if it's doing it very ineffectively, even if it's really harsh and unpleasant, always doing it to try and keep us safe. That's its purpose. It's trying to keep us safe. No matter how bad a job it is doing it, no matter how bad it's making us feel, that's its aim. And so really, if we can find ways to work with it over time, we can make a huge difference and even turn it into a bit of an ally, because it starts to become more of a signaling mechanism. And by that, I mean, it tells us, it becomes information about what is going on inside us. And that is useful once we actually diffuse that heavy, heavy negative charge that often goes with it. So these cognitive distortions, we don't often put them together so clearly with this inner critical voice, but I think it's useful. And the reason I think it's useful is because we can recognize them quite quickly. I'm going to go through, there are lots of cognitive distortions. I'm going to go through some of the really common ones, which you may recognize, and you'll probably tend to notice more of them for you than others. The aim is not to sort of eliminate it from your life. It's just to use that information as knowledge that there is something going on here, so that we can actually course correct, that we can actually go, oh, hang on, that sounds like that inner critical voice here. I'm just going to check whether it's actually really on point, whether it's really, really something that I need to be paying attention to. The first one is all or nothing thinking. And this is when we become it's got to be this way and not that way. There are some situations where that is true. A lot of the time, however, when we go into this all or nothing thinking, it's actually that something has got triggered, we're in survival mode, and we are no longer able to see a range of options, which is normally the case of what's before us. So if we notice we're in all or nothing thinking a lot, that becomes a very good indicator when we have been triggered, when this inner judge, this critical voice, and remember, I'm using it in this broader sense where inner critic can apply to us, but also be projected out. That all or nothing thinking becomes a very, very good marker. The second one is one of my personal favorites, which is catastrophizing. And this is when something small happens, but for whatever reason, and again, it's going to be a trigger, we go into a cascade of, it's like sliding down a slope where it's getting worse and worse and worse until we end at the bottom in this hellish place of a worst case scenario. Now, there is value in exploring worst case scenarios, but it's only when it's done consciously and not with this kind of falling down a cliff sort of feeling of disaster getting worse and worse. So if we notice that catastrophizing in ourselves, even if we notice it in somebody else, it's good information. But if we notice it in ourselves, we can actually stop before we fly down the hill. The third one is emotional reasoning. And, they all interlink a bit, these things. But what's useful about this is to realize that just because I feel something strongly doesn't make it any more true. Just because I feel, I know it's sort of, I'm saying it again, probably to myself more than anything. Just because I feel something strongly doesn't make it true, even though it feels that way. And you can see the connection with all or nothing thinking, can't you? It's like this extreme compelled, I feel it's got to be true. Well, it actually frees us up a lot if we can notice that that's state is upon us and that we're actually possibly out of touch with the reality of the situation. The fourth one, there are 6 I'm going to go through today, so halfway there. The fourth one is should or must. Should or must. And this is closely related to perfectionism. When we're shoulding ourselves or shoulding other people, you can use it like a verb, very unhelpful, because once again, it's taking this extreme position. I'm going to check my list for number 5, comparison. There is a difference between discernment, a comparison of discernment, which is when we're evaluating and we're in touch with that kind of grayness of the situation, not the all or nothing comparison. When we do that all or nothing comparison, that is when we're in this critical state, critic state. We raise somebody else's status in comparison to ours. We lower someone else's status in comparison to ours. It has this quality of hierarchy to it, putting ourselves above or below somebody else and fixing that in place, making it part of how we're experiencing the world. Again, very useful to notice, because when we do, we can be pretty sure, and in the world of social media these days, we can be pretty sure that we've fallen out of our clarity and are in this kind of hijacked, critical mode. And the last one is mind reading. This is when we think we know what somebody else is thinking. We can observe actions, we can observe their face, we can observe movements, but we don't actually know what is going on inside them. And if we do that, it can have a very, very damaging effect on our relationships, because we are making assumptions about what is going on for somebody else rather than checking and asking. Excuse me. So all of these 6, there are many more, but these are 6 which are very, very, very common. All of these 6 are distortions and cognitive distortions, and they are ways that we are in a kind of compulsive state of understanding what is going on in our world. And they all have this critical edge to ourselves or to others about them. When we're in that state, we're just not optimal to connect to others. We're not optimal to make decisions. We're not optimal in an optimal state for just really seeing what's going on. And if we turn it round, because we could actually make it into a judgment, into an inner critic, I'm mind reading again. Terrible. All or nothing thinking again. Terrible. But if we can do it with a little bit of lightness and start to notice when we move into those states, they become a wonderful signal as to when this inner critic, this inner judge, is active. And that is the absolute number one key to not taking the actions towards ourselves or others, which are actually going against what we really care about. It's the number one way that we can actually move back to what we really care about. So that's just a little bit about the inner critic and that voice that it has. There's a lot more. The basic idea of it, just to go back to this one thing which diffuses the charge, is that it's trying to protect us. It's just not doing the best job. And we can actually use it as information. And in doing so, we transform our experience of the inner critic.